to 10% maybe of deaf people grow up with deaf parents, which means that there's a very small percentage of the community who have access to a language from the very beginning when they are born, from day one on. The rest, and we're talking about a good 90% of deaf people who have parents who are not deaf, don't have access to sign language from day one. And there are some horror stories that you would not believe. I mean, people will tell stories of, they'll see their family laughing, and the deaf kid will say, what's going on? They'll say, oh, we don't, it's nothing, we're not going to tell you. You know, or don't worry about it, or you think you're being laughed at. I mean, just things that you wouldn't even believe that people will say. And it happens in the family, it happens at doctor's office, it happens all over the place. And part of the problem is that parents are told that this is a pathological problem, and they're being told by professionals, doctors and others, that they need to teach their kids how to read lips and how to speak English, even though it's not accessible to them. So the parents are being told not to allow their kids to have language to what would be their have access to what would be their native language. There's also autism examples with captioning. A lot of programs aren't captioned. Somebody else makes those choices. So a lot of the activism, you'll see demonstrations at movie theaters where people want to have things captioned. You even go and get movies from Blockbuster or other places, and you can't get something that's captioned even though it says it is. I went down to Disney World a couple of years ago, and they have all of the different areas, Epcot Center, and I don't know, all these different venues down there, right? So they said that they were having interpreters at certain venues at certain times. So I said that I wanted to go to some things at certain times, but what I was told was, no, I could go to this park at this time, I could go to this venue the next day at this time. I had no freedom to travel around the venues as I wanted to. I was being told where and when I could go at certain times, and it was because they had scheduled interpreters there at only very specific times. I had to pay the same price to get into Disney World and all of these other things. And of course I fought for it, and so I actually got an interpreter to go with me to things that I wanted to at certain points. And I had been told that I would have to go find the interpreter, that I would have to do all of this other stuff, but it was me who was going to have to make the adjustments, as opposed to, as everyone else has said, society and the ability to actually choose and have the freedom to travel, to move, to choose what it was I wanted to have. By the third day, and because of my perseverance and stubbornness is probably what it would be called, I actually got to do some of what I wanted to do on my own schedule. Disney World has some things that are captioned, but not on the screen, because you wouldn't want to have the captioning interfere with those who could actually hear what was on the screen. And so what they have is this screen that sits in front of the person, but you know how far that is then from the actual screen where everything's being shown. So it's really not accessible. It's a joke, because you can't really get the two at the same time. And you use the argument of, look, you've got foreign subtitles in a movie, they're right there up on the screen, it doesn't bother anybody, but no, not for this, it's not going to happen. Can you imagine if you had 10 deaf people who wanted to go to the same film? They only have 2 of these screens. So what, we're supposed to gather around 5 people to a screen? It's just a joke. Every once in a while, a theater will do a special preview with captioning, but it's once a month. And it tends to be children's movies that are captioned, not movies that adults would necessarily go to. So there's this implicit message of what kind of movies deaf people can see and might be interested in seeing. I might want to see a violent movie, a movie with sex in it. Maybe I choose a children's movie, but I don't get to choose. It's chosen for me by someone else. I wanted to see Finding Nemo, but why is that my only choice? I want to talk a little bit about the concept of genocide. there's this belief by society, by many individuals in the society, that your ability to hear is it directly correlates with your intelligence. People listen to the radio all the time. People listen to messages that are given over an intercom, that sort of thing. And so if a deaf person can't hear these things, they must live in a silent world. This is just not the case. It's not much noisier than you would even believe, because we see everything with our eyes. So politicians and doctors have created this thing called the cochlear implant. It's an extraordinarily invasive procedure where something is implanted in your skull. And the sole reason of it is that you could hear, so that you will not be deaf anymore. It's sort of the same concept, a simplistic concept of an implanted hearing aid. But to everyone in the community, it's the same, it's equal to genocide. Because what they're doing is, as soon as a baby is identified as deaf, and we're talking about babies who don't even have the ability to choose yet, and parents who are not well informed, they're putting them in the babies. And what it does is it says to everyone that it must be an awful, pitiful thing to be deaf. I'm a faculty tenured professor at a university, and I don't understand what's wrong with being deaf. There's nothing wrong with it. Linda mentioned mainstream schools and how, in general, the idea seemed like a not bad idea at first. But when you're talking about 90% of kids who go into mainstream schools don't end up having any peers in their school. Usually there's one deaf person in a school, one deaf kid in a school. And they work with a sign language interpreter through their 12 years of schooling, and that's the only person who can communicate with them. Some of the larger cities will have a program for deaf students, and so there will be maybe, several or even 40 or 50 kids in one school. But when you look at the United States, for the most part, there are single deaf kids in these schools, and they've been taken out of any environment in which they might learn their language or use their language, which would be the deaf schools, and so all of that has been taken away from them. At Gallaudet these days, there's a big difference from what it used to be, because so many kids are now coming to us from mainstream schools. And we see it not only in their language difference, but their maturity level is much lower than the kids who grew up with the language, grew up in deaf schools. They might be able to write English, but they don't have a language. Their writing is not written English. Their direct communication with professors is something that they have dreamed about their entire lives. But again, the maturity level is lower, and they don't have the self-confidence, they don't have the self-esteem that people who grow up, obviously, with a language and the ability to communicate have. And so a lot of professors some of the professors who see the kids who do come from the deaf families and who do come from the deaf schools and who can speak their minds, those kids end up getting called radical and troublemakers and all of that, because they actually know how to have a conversation and how to speak their mind and get on in the world. So in many, many ways, communication is key. You want to have somebody who has curiosity, who wants to find out about the world, who wants to engage in dialogue, but then they're getting labeled radical and troublemakers. It's the professors at the university who have grown up in a deaf family and a deaf school who also can work with the students in the same way that they come to the university. This may surprise you, but there's probably 75% of the faculty at Gallaudet who are not deaf. And out of that 75%, there's probably 10%, and this might be a radical estimate,